welcome to those here with us in Cambridge, to those joining us online. This is our second online event in the anniversary series. It's the third event for those persisting with us here in Cambridge. I'm Dr. Iona Hine, the Communications and Programme Manager here at Cambridge Interfaith Programme. And joining me today, we have the Reverend Dr. Catriona Laing, who is currently a priest in the Diocese of Europe, based between Brussels and Leuven. And then we have Miriam Lorie, who is currently a rabbi in training. She's also a Jewish educator and sometimes to be heard on Radio 2, Pause for Thought. Please welcome our panellists. So I've already introduced you in terms of your current roles, and I suspect we're going to be able to dig into a bit about how those involve interfaith relations. But we're here at an anniversary celebration, and you each also have a stake in CIP's history. So I'd like to start by asking each of you to explain something about your time with Cambridge Interfaith Programme. And I shall start with Catriona on this occasion.
So hello everyone, it's really good to be back. It's a bit of a time warp actually, and I'm feeling quite weird today coming back to Cambridge and seeing all these familiar faces, and I can't believe it's a 20th anniversary. That's also slightly alarming. But I was involved in the Cambridge Interfaith Programme from 2005 to 2008 as the project manager, and I was working with Ben Quash and David Ford and Tim Jenkins when Tim was talking about field work earlier, I was thinking it was a bit like field work for the Cambridge Interfaith Programme. We were doing a 3-year feasibility study to see whether we could make this project fly, both as an academic research programme here and a public education programme elsewhere. So that was my job for 3 years, was basically to try and figure out whether we could make it work.
Thank you. Miriam.
Okay, well, I was here about a year after Trin left, so we had a bit of a gap. We didn't get to work together from 2009 to 2016. So I was around for the 10-year anniversary of CIP, and it's also very scary that was 10 years ago. I was involved in lots of different programs, the CIP Summer School, we have an alumna in the audience, and also the Senior Faith Leadership Programme, which Michael Wakelin, Michael is, hello Michael, which Michael ran as well, bringing together faith leaders, Abraham House, Coexist House, which hopefully we'll get a chance to speak about, and lots of scriptural reasoning. And the scariest time was when David was on sabbatical and I had to be the acting director.
Thank you. So this might be a slightly personal question, and you can go as personal as you want in answering it, but I'm really curious about what it was that disposed you both to engage in interfaith relations. Was there a critical moment that motivated you to work in interfaith spaces? What is there as you kind of look back, maybe beyond those 20 years, that kind of might act as a bit of an explanation? So I'll come to you first, Miriam, on this.
Okay. Well, I was always a seeker of truth as a teenager. More than I was interested in Judaism, actually. Originally, I was interested in other religions. At school, I'd go along to all the different faith societies. And then I chose to study theology here for that reason, and thought, well, I should probably go and study my own religion first before coming to learn it from other people. So I took myself off for a gap year studying at an Orthodox Jewish seminary in the old city of Jerusalem, and fell in love, I suppose. And even during that year, I remember sitting in the old city and hearing out of the window the muezzin calling and the bells of one of the many amazing churches in the old city, and thinking that so much faith and beauty was so close at hand, and yet they weren't coming together, and what a pity that was. And so that continued when I was at university. I was very excited that there was an interfaith programme here, and it was really my dream job to get the job here.
Catriona.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it kind of echoes your experience in a way. I grew up in the Middle East in the Muslim world, and so sort of grew up living with interfaith relations around me with Muslim friends and Christian friends. So I think it was always in my sort of being to seek that out. And then I worked in Iraq for a year and a half. And one of the things that most inspired me while I was there was watching the way an Anglican priest, Andrew White, worked with Muslim leaders, actually to sort of try and negotiate peace between Shia and Sunni leaders in Baghdad. And often it was Andrew's presence that was helping these conversations. And I sort of saw this amazing example of not really interfaith dialogue, but just people of different faiths working together towards something, and was very inspired. Actually, that's where I sensed a real calling to the priesthood. And so I left Iraq to come and train for ministry in the Church of England, and then got sidetracked into coming to join the team here and actually get a bit more experience of interfaith work before being ordained.
Okay.
Headhunted is another word.
Headhunted, says Ben Wash. Our event just now is called, entitled "Managing Interfaith Relations," and I wonder, now that you've given us the sort of starting point and an impression of what you did during your time in CIP, do you see yourself as someone who manages interfaith relations? What does it mean to manage interfaith relations? Does interfaith dialogue need managing? Why? And if it does, then what are the competencies that you would associate with good interfaith management? And I ask that question very aware that there have been conversations recently in the UK Interfaith Network, thinking what is it that prepares people to hold open interfaith spaces. So Miriam, we'll come to you.
Okay. Well, I think three things structured this answer. I think sometimes it's making space, sometimes it's holding space, and sometimes it's stepping into the space. And I'll say what I mean by each of those. So making space is quite a lot of what Iona has been doing this week, and just being on the receiving end of her emails has brought back so many memories of organising conferences, a lot of kind of organising complex dietary needs for our different participants, running an interfaith summer school, and all just the setting up of getting people into a space together, just the making space, the practical. And sometimes that's all you need to do, and the people come in and they run themselves, and it's lovely. But actually, I think a lot of the time you do need to hold the space as well, and that, human beings, we can have conversations, we can get on well, we can have brilliant things together. But something like the scriptural reasoning that you've just experienced before, that takes a kind of holding, that takes preparation of the text packs, it takes a facilitator who knows a bit of what they're doing, it takes a bit of structure, and with that structure, with that holding, you can achieve so much more. And then sometimes it takes a little bit of intervening and managing, and hopefully I'm allowed to tell an anecdote. Yeah, I hope this is okay. But one of the really tricky situations that I remember, really fascinating to hear if you've got any similar memories.
I know, I'm racking my brain now.
And Sarah will probably remember this, because Sarah was director of the summer school that we were running when this happened. We can never anticipate the issues that would come up at a summer school. I think it was 2014 when there was a conflict in Gaza, and we were like, oh gosh, what's going to happen when we run a summer school for Jews, Muslims and Christians this summer? But actually that wasn't the issue that flared up. The issue was that we had in the room a delegation of Omani students from the Sultanate of Oman, and we also happened to have among our we used to have 10 Omani delegates and 10 non-Omanis. And from our 10 non-Omani delegates, we had a couple of very liberal American people, I think one Jewish, one Christian. And the kind of tinderbox issue was LGBTQ issues. I think one speaker said one comment about the Pride Parade, and boom, it was an explosion. And, on one end of the spectrum, you had Omanis who were beautiful peacemakers, really very conflict avoiding, who were saying there's no issue here because there are no gay people in Oman. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you had people saying, well, this isn't a safe space for me anymore. How can I stay here? I feel let down by the people who are even allowing this other view to exist. So in that situation, we actually had to step in and kind of manage, not just in terms of making sure that there was a good kosher meal on the table, but in terms of making sure that people didn't come to fisticuffs.
That's a pretty thorough answer, and I like how you step things out. Catriona, what are you coming up with as your kind of sense about managing interfaith relations?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I heard the question differently, because I found myself thinking that CIP always steered away from managing relations, and that, you know, we were trying to move from a style of interfaith dialogue where people sit around with cups of mint tea and samosas and talk about, you know, what they believe, and then try and figure out at the end of an hour where they agree or where they disagree. And, you know, all of you in the room will know the great sort of CIP mantra about friendship over consensus. And I think that's what really drew me to the project, was that I wasn't trying to do interfaith. And, you know, as a person of faith, I'm spending my life trying to make the connections between my scriptures, my tradition, the doctrines I've inherited, and the world that I live in. And an extension of that is also making those connections with people of other faiths. So I think if there was going to be something about managing it, it's about providing the context and the opportunities to make those relationships and those friendships. And I think when I was at CIP, where I saw that working best was when we identified a shared project, whether that was scriptural reasoning or whether it was something more sort of practical, like working with the police or with prison chaplains. Or I've been really inspired recently by the Faiths for climate change group that, you know, are bringing together people of different faiths to fight for better responses to climate change. So it's a bit of a garbled response, but I think it just, for me, really seems to be that, you know, the questions of our day are about belonging. And you can't really manage that sense of belonging, but that's what we're all looking for, is to understand our own identities and belongings, and then to see how we balance that with seeking the flourishing of other people's sense of belonging and identity. And probably the way we do that best is through friendships.
I think that I find that those two answers are really wonderful in the way that they complicate the question and they address the practical, and the practical really matters, because we wouldn't have these people in front of us in a room if there hadn't been some practical approaches to organising things. But there is equally just such a profound truth in, you know, interfaith relations happen regardless of whether anybody, right, the beginning of interfaith relations is that there are people coming into contact with each other. But
Can I actually give one example of what I was trying to say? So before living in Brussels, I served in a church in Washington, DC, right downtown in just a few blocks from the White House. And the Muslim Association of Washington don't have a mosque in downtown DC. And so they used our church for Friday prayers. And there was this amazing moment every Friday where I would finish the morning Eucharist, and there'd be about 3 people at the Friday morning Eucharist, and then 250 Muslims would arrive and spread prayer mats across. We had a big labyrinth in the sanctuary, and spread prayer mats across the labyrinth and pray. And people from the church were always asking if we could have some interfaith events, you know, and they wanted to have a meal or something. And we never got round to organising it. And the Muslim Society were the sort of leaders that that I was engaging with, were a wonderful group and very gracious and hospitable and all of that. But I came away with this sense that they didn't really feel the need for us to sit down and have, you know, more conversation together. What was important for them and for us was that we were praying our prayers in this space, and we were enabling that for them. And honestly, they were encouraging us, because, you know, we were always so embarrassed by how few people there were coming to church on Friday. But it was this amazing sort of sense of presence that we had, or awareness of each other's presence. And I can't actually remember what event it was now, but there was some horrible attack against some Muslims while we were there. And suddenly that relationship was really important, and we all had a sense of communication, and we were in touch with each other, and it was all there when we needed it. But what had been really important was that we just enabled this sense of being good people of faith.
So we've really touched on your roles within CIP, but not in any depth. And I think this might be the moment where I see if I can find out if there's anything particularly as you've been looking back and thinking in preparation for this that has stood out as a highlight of your time with CIP. And I'll come this time first to Miriam.
I think the travel, because it was so great, and I feel like we're not quite in that world anymore where you can get on an aeroplane and go and meet people in the places that we went to, Jordan, Egypt, the USA, Turkey and Israel. And I think what I really learned, and coming out of kind of having a student loan and that sort of thing, at first I thought, well, this is a little bit what's the word, it's a bit unnecessary to kind of fly and stay in a hotel and that kind of thing. But when I was there, I remember the first trip with you, David, thinking, oh, it all makes sense now, because when you're in the same room as another human being, something changes in a way that it doesn't on the phone or on Zoom or Skype, as it was back then. And I think that's just been such a reinforced message during the pandemic, that online stuff is brilliant, but in-person stuff is so much better, qualitatively better. So the travel was amazing. I think it made connections, it made relationships happen, it made donations happen, it made understanding happen. So that was definitely a highlight for me. And then as well as that, just the programs we had with young faith leaders and more senior faith leaders, where we'd see people come together, and it was such a privilege to be in that space as a witness, even if I was running around kind of working on badges and travel and whatever else, all about. But, just to be there and watch as just plucking memories out the air, Hine from Egypt playing the piano and everyone standing around, or everyone playing croquet together at Mattingley Hall. These are incredible opportunities that can only happen when you make a space that's far away sometimes for people. We provided in Mattingley Hall this real escape from their usual worlds, where they could have conversations, have space, have walks together, and really make quite incredible breakthroughs. And we see online that those relationships still exist, both for the young leaders and the senior leaders. Everyone's now a senior leader, because that's how old we are. And I think one last highlight, I'm happy to go into any of these more because it was also so brilliant, was working with museums on the Coexist House project. And I'd love to hear Trin talk about this, because Trin was really there where it all began. But Abraham House was the idea to create a museum learning centre in London where faiths could come together, learn about one another, other people could learn about religions. It would be a place of understanding and discovery. And there's no museum of religion in London at the moment, and what a gap that is. So for quite a lot of my time at CIP, and increasingly towards the end, I was working on Coexist House, working with the Victoria and Albert Museum and various other partners to try and get it off the ground. And sadly, in the end, it didn't come to fruition, but maybe it will in the future. Hold out that hope. And we've got lots of really great preliminary studies that are ready. Actually, Michael, I think you maybe mentioned that there is some exhibition plan in train at the Museum of London.
We may be able to come to that at a subsequent moment. So you've planted something there that we may get time to come back to. So Catriona, what would you kind of bring out as a highlight? So we're going slightly further back in time. What stands out for you?
I mean, the museum stuff was great. Thank you for reminding me of that. I really enjoyed that, partly because I'd never sort of learnt about how you begin to think about museums. But I have to say the two main highlights for me were learning scriptural reasoning, and that's something that I've kept with me, and it was a really fun part of the feasibility study project was to try scriptural reasoning in lots of different contexts and to watch it move from the academy into other kinds of groups of people and places. So that was brilliant. And I'm going to get a bit gushy and emotional now and say that the other highlight was working with David and Ben and him and just people who have great brains. We all know that. But in David, I saw someone who recognizes that he can learn stuff from people much younger than him. And he really promotes that in younger people. And I watched him, I worked really closely with David and watched how he sort of turned to listen to what I or one of my contemporaries was saying about, in scriptural reasoning, but also in about like, how should we do this project? How should we bring it off the ground? And giving me the opportunity to take the floor and, chair the meeting or whatever. And sometimes with quite important people, big funders, whatever it was. And I felt that David really trusted me to do that as a 25-year-old. And that was amazing. And I really want to try and do that myself as I find myself now in a position with students in my congregation who want to do things. And that sense of enabling people was really good. And that came with this kind of energy that that the feasibility study had of sort of dreaming big and wanting to put this into action. And that was only possible from the energy that David poured into it all the time. And so yeah, that was a real highlight for me.
Thank you. So I asked our panellists what they might have thought that we should talk about. And Miriam, you were keen that we reflect on the role that Cambridge Interfaith Programme has in relation to the public. And I think the term you used was public education. So I've already explained to Miriam that I wanted to say something about the term public education because it's actually, it's not something we would tend to say in a university context now. We talk particularly about public engagement. And that is a transition that has happened alongside another one. So when I was first employed by a university to be doing something, the money that paid for it was a knowledge transfer grant. So the idea is that the knowledge is inside the university and we're going to take it and transfer it to the public. And I really appreciate the fact that a decade or so ago, the language changed and became language of knowledge exchange. And that recognised that, yes, there is knowledge in the university, but there are all kinds of knowledges outside the university, and we need to be wise to that. So absolutely that engagement in the public realm, but there is something about it that maybe is a different model or metaphor that I find useful. So having put all of that to one side, I still think yes, absolutely. I do want to know what you think is a good example of CIP's role within the public realm, and I want to hear why that's so important, and whether there are places where there's not enough of Cambridge Interfaith Programme, or I mean, we only can stretch ourselves so far. Things like Cambridge Interfaith Programme, and since Miriam, you raised us the question, I'm going to come to you first, but I'll try and switch the order up. So yeah, what do you make of the question?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that the language has changed. I'd like to think that we probably were always doing where it's ended up, even if the language was maybe quite clumsy. And I think this also came up in a really interesting way on the first panel, where we talked about whether, trying to get the wording right, but whether, if I understood it correctly, whether anthropologists or other academics in Cambridge could make better use of what's going on in CIP. So, for example, should we have had an anthropologist watching the summer programs and just doing anthropology of how a bunch of 20 Muslim, Jewish and Christian leaders form, storm, norm and perform? So that's a question. I think it's just that what CIP has is really good. Scriptural reasoning is really good. The idea of being really accurate and doing good research really matters. There's nothing worse than being in an interfaith space and someone else speaks for you in a way that's not quite right. It just feels so it kind of undoes all the good of being there in the first place. So I really appreciated when I came to CIP that scriptural reasoning was about, it started off with the turning to the person whose text it was, asking questions. Sometimes it never gets beyond that stage, but eventually I think really good scriptural reasoning does get beyond that stage where there's where it becomes not only a kind of three-way teaching exercise, but kind of having a mirror held up to you where you can see yourself differently through someone else's eyes. So I just wanted to see that get out there in the world and be really well held. And I think also people need empowering. When you say to people, we're going to do a three-way text study, they kind of think, oh gosh, or if they see the word Cambridge, they think, oh gosh, I can't be part of that. But I think if CIP can be part of holding the spaces really well and empowering really well, it's just going to do so much good out there in the world. Where is there not enough CIP? Everywhere.
Catriona.
I don't have much to add to that. I think Miriam's really covered it and spot on.
Okay, fair enough. That allows me to kind of, so, you've heard what Miriam said. You told me it makes sense for you. And I mean, is that true in Belgium also? What about Washington? Are there things that you've experienced in the different settings that you've gone on to?
Well, I'll say a bit about Belgium because that's where I am now, and I feel like more people here probably know more about Washington. I mean, I think these issues are everywhere, and I think Belgium it'd be great to have something like CIP in Belgium. There's relations between different religions are complicated, like they are everywhere. There's the Muslim communities in Belgium are having a really tough time. And interestingly, the Anglicans are sort of advocating on their behalf to the Belgian state. So I think there's always need for more opportunities for, this kind of thing in the public realm. We do have a scriptural reasoning group in the EU institutions, which is really fun. So that's one way that we're, bringing the CIP idea to a small part of Brussels. So yeah, I mean, I think there's always scope for more.
So I'm going to step off piste very slightly, and you'll let me know if you can't, think that these are unreasonable questions. But I feel like, so we've referred quite a lot to scriptural reasoning, which is an activity where you need to persuade people to come and do it. And I don't think that's the whole of what public engagement might be. So earlier on, there was a reference, and I didn't pick up on it at the time, to a project with the police. But I just wonder about that kind of sort of exchange with specific publics, and whether there are other examples around that maybe we could sort of, I guess I'm fishing for maybe anecdotes or examples of going to specific publics and an exchange with them maybe on their terms, rather than alongside of the sort of scriptural reasoning model, or maybe even using scriptural reasoning, but that, because I think there's been some of that, and we maybe haven't, if we're picking up on a history of CIP, it would be good to kind of to make sure we capture those examples too. If either of you want to speak to that.
I mean, there are others here who were more involved, but when I referred to the police, that was one that we got quite far down the line of putting into action in London, which was to explore bringing scriptural reasoning into kind of, I guess, I don't know what aspect of police training it would be, but what we were hearing, I'm looking at Jim because I feel like he's probably more involved in this kind of thing in London through his university work as well. But people who were being trained in the police and happened to be Muslim, Christian, or Jewish police people were looking for ways of building relationships, not because they wanted to do interfaith dialogue, but because they wanted to operate well as police together, and they wanted to treat people that they came across well. And so they were really interested in doing something that sort of took people out of this we're doing interfaith dialogue thing and offering them just a practice to engage with. And as I mentioned, we also explored doing that with prison chaplains, where again you have people of different faiths working in a particular environment together, and we were sort of presenting the idea that if they, as chaplains, had good relationships because they had experienced some kind of shared practice together, then they would probably be better equipped to be effective chaplains in their prison work. But I know that there are experts, I'm also looking at Beth, who have done more of this kind of work than me, so maybe it's one for the floor as well.
Okay, thank you for boldly taking on a challenge there. So that brings me to a question. So I haven't said, I did actually say to our audience here, but I didn't say for our online audience that we do have a gap on the panel today. So unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Nadiya Takolia has not been able to join us today. At inception, Cambridge Interfaith Programme was given a strong but non-exclusive commitment to fostering interaction between Abrahamic religions, so Islam, Christianity, Judaism. Some of that is reflected in the structures of this event series, and I tried quite hard that it should be in this panel too, partly I think actually at your suggestion, Catriona, and it was a good one. And of course, I think it's important to say that when we do that, it's not that people act as representatives for their religion. That doesn't really make sense, because each religion has its own integral diversity. But really as part of a commitment to, in this case, to platforming different voices. So my question is, would you reflect on that Abrahamic commitment, both in terms of managed interfaith events and in terms of your subsequent patterns of interfaith relation, which may not have taken that form? What does it mean, whether for you, for Cambridge Interfaith Programme, to do Abrahamic interfaith relations? Are there benefits that you see? Are there disadvantages to that? And this is quite a long question, but is the situation today, 2022, different from 2002? Catriona, I'm coming to you first.
I'm sure anyone working in interfaith work has kind of had the conversation around Abrahamic, or do we extend that in different ways to different groups? And certainly the line that the thinkers behind the Cambridge Interfaith Programme would encourage me to think about was that there is an integrity to the Abrahamic religious traditions and their relations that, well, actually talking kind of more personally, that is instinctively makes sense to me and I feel at home in. And that's not to say that I'm not interested in the way in which those traditions then relate to other religious traditions, but I think that's a different kind of conversation, and that we should be having both, and that there are all sorts of different ways of drawing those lines of connection, but that it did make sense to us when we were thinking about the project at the feasibility stage to have this this Abrahamic core to it, and then to sort of have the freedom to step out of that to explore these other connections with other religious traditions. Your second part was about 2002.
It's the 20 years, yeah. Right? It's 20 years made a difference to how we think about these things.
I mean, it's funny, I was saying to Ben earlier, I feel maybe it's just having read too much of the newspaper on my way over this morning on the train from Brussels. But I think that there's so much anxiety in the world at the moment, and there are some really, really bad things going on. And that's framing certainly my preaching and my conversations and everything. And honestly, Muslim, Christian, Jewish relations are not top of my sort of conversation agenda at the moment. And I don't think that's just that I'm not working in an interfaith program anymore. I feel like people are really worried in this country about how they're going to pay their bills in a few months' time. And maybe that's an interesting point of conversation and connection across religious traditions, that, you know, we're all going to be facing similar crises. So that's a conversation. There's a war going on. That's another conversation. You know, there's a climate crisis, and I think that for me the conversation is very different to 20 years ago because of the other things going on in the world right now, and hopefully interfaith relations can be a positive piece of that conversation right now.
Okay, Miriam.
Yeah, that was really powerful, Trin. Thank you. I think probably out there in the world and our various communities that we work in, wherever there are different faiths living side by side, that is the communities who should be talking to each other. I think for CIP, which was working with scriptures, it makes a lot of sense to have the Abrahamic connection because they're a family of scriptures who refer to each other as, we could even pick up at the SR earlier, Akhlaq Kitab, with people of the book. And so it does make sense. I did always wonder why Baha'i were left out, but there's a question. But we did actually, we've done scriptural reasoning with non-Abrahamic religions. David's taken it to China and done it with Buddhists and Confucians. We've done it with Hindu texts. So it's been done, it works, and I think we should definitely not restrict CIP's work to Abrahamic faith.
Thank you. I mean, I was thinking for myself, I wonder whether one of the things of whether we risk homogenizing Abrahamic faiths by circumscribing them, whether there's actually, because I asked you, this sort of question about benefits and disadvantages, whether we can accidentally trap ourselves. So Tim this morning made a point about there not being a fourth thing to get to, right? So there is no construction that's the kind of, you didn't use this phrase, but there's no lowest common denominator version that we're working towards. So I think that's important, but are we missing things that we could be talking about by prioritizing the Abrahamic? Which is, I'm not saying that we shouldn't. That I feel like it's a very key part of CIP's identity, but I think it's also interesting to think about what are we missing by doing the things we're doing, because are there other things that we can be doing too? But that was not necessarily a very good question. That was just off the cuff reflection. And then Catriona, in relation to what you were saying, it took me into is that part of why one of the things we're seeing is people doing things together? Like, is it that actually part of the need needs to be doing, which isn't necessarily something that CIP is ideally set to do, right? We're primarily, my colleagues are researchers, and their expertise is research. And then I come along and say, right, how are we going to share this research? And some of them have really excellent and interesting ideas for how we share research and who we might talk to. And some of those ideas are sort of related with our Religion and Global Challenges initiative that ESRA has thought into being, and thinking about how we might work to engage with policymakers in order to think about the ways where religion might be missing from the agenda, but might actually be doing something terribly important in the background. So when we get issues which are major in many people's lives, say around race and racism, sometimes religion is doing horrific things in the background, and we need to be sort of alive to those kinds of conversations where maybe people don't want to talk about religion being there, but we need to do that and to be able to bring some of the expertise that resides and is being developed in this university, also in other universities. I don't want to claim it's a unique preserve, but I'm just kind of teasing at the seams, because I think sometimes when we look back, we can think that the future has to hold the same thing and that it should. So that's, I guess, where I'm nudging at. So I guess actually I've kind of anticipated my own question, but which is really, from your current perspectives, what are the challenges for interfaith relations, and how should we respond to that? And who the we is in that's up to you. You can tell CIP what it should do, that's fine. I'm open to it. We may not do what you tell us, but equally for yourselves. But yeah, what are the challenges that we're facing now? And I should pick who goes first. Miriam.
I think even more than ever before, we're living in silos created by social media and the media we consume. And that just means people are less aware of difference out there, less aware of other communities, other approaches to the world. And what should we do? And I would definitely not be the person to do this, but we need a really brilliant interfaith social media campaign, which can somehow get through the algorithms and open minds and give people an opening to learning about other people. That's what I would do if I could wave my magic wand.
Yeah, that's great. I'm not sure. I really don't know. I mean, I think the challenges in some ways are the ones they've always been. And I think, yeah, that's about figuring out how to live together well with all the differences that we have. And what I said at the beginning about kind of finding this balance between understanding ourselves and seeking the flourishing of people who are different to us. I think that's really at the heart of interfaith work. And I think that happens at all different levels. And, best of all, it happens with your neighbours and in your community where hopefully people are getting out again. And then hopefully that, has a ripple effect in all sorts of other spheres.
So I think both of those answers are helpful, and it occurs to me to tell you about one of the things that we have just begun to get off the ground. CIP is based in the Faculty of Divinity. It occurred to me actually in thinking about this last night that in the history of the University of Cambridge, a university now more than 800 years old, 20 years is not very much. But this specific building that we're in is only 22 years old, and therefore we can claim a much greater part in its history. But one of the things that we've been trying to do just over the past couple of years is to strengthen our connections and make sure that we are thinking about who is doing stuff relevant to CIP. So we, in terms of catalysing interreligious inquiry, not just inside the Faculty of Divinity, because religion isn't actually stuck in one faculty, and to reach out to people doing research elsewhere in the university. And we've just got ourselves to the stage where we have an interfaith research forum that means that people can affiliate with us and we can become gradually aware of where there are pockets of work. Now, the reason that I was suddenly inspired to tell you that is because one of our affiliates, Dr. Marie Chabert, she's in French studies, but she is also a UN ambassador on a scheme that is precisely about trying to train up. So they have, I might get my numbers wrong, but it's at least 18 young people recruited from across Europe, and it's more than Europe, but I can't remember the specific regions. And they are being given training and brought together by the UN in order to be better speakers about religion and interreligious stuff, and doing that as a cohort. So there are things that are going on that CIP isn't necessarily doing itself, but which we can amplify by deepening our connections and by looking outside and kind of finding ways of going beyond the small core of us here in the faculty. So I just take the opportunity to share that.
That's great.
So I think that this might be a good time to actually open out to the floor. And as I promised, rather than getting you to ask us questions, which would break the pledge that I gave to my co-panellists, which is that there would be no unexpected questions, we actually want to bring a question to you. So we've got this panel, it's on managing interfaith relations. If we'd had Nadiya with us, we would also have a different perspective on someone who has been working in CIP and has gone on to continue to do stuff in the domain of interfaith relations. But so I think maybe I start with people who've been involved with CIP and ask you if you have a reflection on how it's influenced you in managing interfaith relations, or any of the other questions that we have discussed. So I am looking around. Take a moment to consider the question, and if you're David, the microphone is just coming for you.
No, it's just something that we had a thing in Rose Castle just 2 weeks ago on blockchain and trust and peace building. And it just related. You triggered it by your response, Miriam, about silos and social media and the internet and so forth. And we had an extraordinary a keynote address from. How do you pronounce her? Church. Lydia?
Professor Church from the Kroc Institute.
Yeah, from the Kroc Institute in Notre Dame University. And basically it was on a new word to me, peace tech. and I'm just intrigued how, it seemed to bring together for us a whole range of stuff. We had around our table in that, people who had done, about 4 people had done startups and so forth. And so there was all that with the interfaith expertise and the Rosecastle team, some of the Rosecastle team were there. And it really was the most exciting sort of thing because so much conflict in the world is funded by algorithms and things, and the conflicts online and so forth. How do you have peace online? It's one of the huge issues for just look at America for a start. and and I'm just we're not supposed to ask you questions, so I won't. But
they've told me they're happy to answer questions.
No, but I really am fascinated by how you see this dimension of things, because you raised it, Miriam, and it does seem to me it's pervasive. We have to deal with it all the time. And how we do, how something like CIP does it in the future, how Rosecastle does it. We're already planning a whole dimension of things, that actually integrate that. But I'm interested, how anybody else thinks about that too.
I don't have big answers, but as you're speaking, I'm reflecting that it goes both ways. We've got silos, so we're just not encountering other perspectives. But when we do encounter other perspectives, there is just such a lack of the human decency that you would have speaking to someone face to face. And anyone who's got caught into some kind of late night argument with someone else on the internet will know it just it somehow riles people up in a really quite shocking way. And so how you get around that, how you create an etiquette for the internet, or do you actually have to work with some kind of peace tech or algorithm to police it and have a bot that doesn't allow you to post something really offensive to someone else? Do we need to start training school kids in internet etiquette?
I think it's really interesting as well, and the only sort of maybe this alternative I want to throw out is that I know that, so my husband's a journalist and we used to be in America, and he had a very interesting trip to San Francisco while we were there and interviewing lots of people in the tech industry. And what he came back most struck by was how all the super tech giants, none of their kids had screens, none of their kids had mobile phones. They were literally going back to blackboards and whiteboards because they know how bad it is. They're ahead of the game, basically. And I just wonder whether, yes, we need to be able to enter that conversation on social media because that's where we're at now, but also that in a slightly more prophetic way, there's something about modelling a better alternative. And that, as you say, actually, just like your travel, what we need is to find ways of bringing people together real time in person. And that might be, I feel like I've become a parish priest since I was at CIP, but that's, in small ways, in local communities with the people that you live and work amongst. And I think that could be a real gift to this conversation if we could also do that.
So I think those are really interesting answers. And without taking away from them, I want to add something, because there's an important dimension that I think maybe we as people in the room today can miss. And that's, I spent a considerable bit of time in the early days of the pandemic watching people talk about church online. And there were a crowd of voices who would complain that this was not as good. But there were also voices, really important voices. And so one of the sort of organisations that I've listened to on this is an organisation called Disability in Jesus, that we're talking about actually our experience is of being excluded from the room, because the room is not somewhere we can get to comfortably, because when we go to the room, we get treated in all these different ways. And actually, we have been building church online for a long time and don't trash our church. So I think it's really important to witness that I think it's true that there is a difference between being in the room, but actually I think there are people who know how to nurture really important qualitative relationships online, and that it humbles us to work out how to do some of that. And I think it's actually really interesting that a decade ago, CIP was trying to create the facilities to do scriptural reasoning online, because scriptural reasoning has been so important for CIP. And if you're in an era of climate change when traveling, flying lots of people across the Atlantic so that we can be in the same room is maybe not something we should aspire to do too regularly, then it matters to figure out what are the ways and the practices that we can use that allow us to get past whatever the obstacles are. So I recognise that being in a room feels different, but I also think there are people who have worked on crafting that, and that we need to recognise the voices of those that society disables, because for those of us who can get in the room, we can get prone to insist that that's the best place to be. So that's just sorry, I get off my soapbox now, but I do think there's something to tease out about the strengths of these different environments and learning how to be and operate differently in them in order to make the best of them. Lots of hands. Elena.
Thank you so much to the speakers and David for the question. I'm Elena Dini from the John Paul II Center for Interreligious Dialogue, Italy. Actually, something that came to my mind when Miriam was talking about this interfaith campaign online, and then with David's question, was what happened actually with the program I run when we were forced to be online. But then when we were thinking about what skills we could be helpful for leaders in interreligious dialogue, was communication skills, because people were doing great things, but they really didn't have. We were somehow so much focused on a theology, interfaith, getting together, which is great. I'm happy that we do, but sometimes it just stuck in our circles. So I think that this is something, if it's not only online, but really working on getting a bit out, so that people might hear more about what we do. But then this was something like on my side thinking when I was hearing the question. But I come to a question that I have. If it's not for the panelists, for anyone else in the room. Because what I also realized, thanks to this communication skills training that we were offering, is that, for example, the group we work with is very diverse. We have clergy, we have religious sisters, we have lay people, different ages, different backgrounds that we train in interreligious dialogue. What would you say, you or anyone else, what would you say about the pros and cons of having different, diverse group of people getting together for interfaith, for being trained in interfaith, rather than having more homogeneous? For example, seminarians, or only young leaders, or only police people working in police forces. Just throwing it to have some thoughts together. Thank you.
I think it's a really interesting question, and I can see pros and cons of both. But I suppose what having a more homogenous group, like say seminarians, might enable is that they already have a shared language. So it depends how much time you've got, I guess. But if you've already got one goal, which is to sort of train them in some sort of working together as in interfaith dialogue, then the fact that they don't have to kind of go through the stage of also explaining themselves as seminarians, because they already know what that means. You've already got to stage 2 of the conversation or the training more quickly. So I think, that's certainly why I was drawn to this idea when we were doing the feasibility study of having context-specific stuff, if you like. But obviously, in another way, it makes for a richer conversation to have different people coming and sharing their experience of interfaith dialogue from the background and the context that they have. So it's not a very conclusive answer, because I think you could probably make an argument for both, but maybe others have other ideas.
I think that there's an interesting thing that's in itself a little bit unpredictable, which is whether by having a sufficient mix, you begin to make a safe space for people to show difference within their own tradition, or not. There was mention this morning amongst the anthropologists, and I think that we touched on it slightly already today, that within religious groups there are polarities and there are things that there's disagreement about. And it can actually be really comforting for somebody to discover that actually those same polarities exist in another religion, and maybe to find somebody who's kind of got more agreement with them on a particularly kind of tense or controversial issue than maybe that they're used to finding amongst co-religionists. And so that then at that point solidarities can start to form that represent other kinds of human connection, because we're all a bundle of things and more than just a religious identity. So there's potential there for something, and that potential can also ripple out. You can hope that there's then some learning that happens because people go back to their own religious communities, and maybe when they hear something being said out of prejudice, they're more likely to say, oh, well, that's not true because, right? Or not all so-and-so think that. So yeah, I think that there is value for doing that stuff at the same time that I think that Catriona's answer was also really helpful for kind of unpacking some of the virtues of being in a space where you've already got a certain commonality. So we had Michael, I think you had a question at the back there. So the microphone is just coming to you.
Yes, Michael Wakeland. We were told not to ask
That's
questions.
True.
But
a question or a reflection on
a reflection on CIP, yeah, because I came here after leaving the BBC in 2010. And apart from the deep joy of working with Miriam and David and Barbara, and I'm going to forget people, Giles, Sarah, Tim, everyone, which has been huge joy for me. I just wanted to say how important the underlying ethos of CIP has been in everything I've gone on to do since I stopped working with you here. The idea of disagreeing well, the idea of maintaining the distinctiveness of our faiths and yet being able to come around a common cause has informed everything that I've done, not only in the projects that are actually born in this building, like the Leadership Programme, like the Religion Media Centre, like the work that I've gone on to do now with big organisations like Marks and Spencer's and the House of Commons. It has fed into everything that I've taken out of here because it's so powerfully strong. But not only those projects, more importantly for me as a broadcaster, and having been looking after Pause for Thought on Radio 2 since I was in my 20s, it has informed all my broadcast work too now. And I want to thank CIP for all that.
Thank you, Michael. Sarah, here, we'll get there.
Thanks very much, Sarah Snyder, Rosecastle Foundation. I just wanted to pick up on some of the discussions around online and in-person meetings, and just go back to that emphasis on the kinds of space that we open and facilitate, not just the people we bring together. And what does that space look like, and what promotes the right ingredients for people to feel they can speak to one another across very big, difficult societal divides, and which kind of spaces don't really encourage that kind of encounter. And we did a really interesting project on how you build trust online, and that was during COVID. And one of the things we found was you've still got the power of the face. And, Levinas and many others have taught us the importance of face-to-face encounter, and it is still possible in an online environment. But that environment needs to be very carefully curated. Small groups, for example, pre-encounter opportunities to just have those personal touch base. How are you today? Where are you coming in from? Not just straight into a scriptural reasoning online, for example. And I just thought I'd give one example. We did a lot of scriptural reasoning across continents, so that was great, and it enabled particularly more women to engage in our programs from country contexts where they wouldn't normally be able to travel quite so easily. So that was exciting to see that. But the example is actually the lead up to the Lambeth Conference we had this year, which is a meeting of the Anglican bishops from right around the world. Happens about every 10 years. In this case, it was like 14 years after the last one. We did 2 years of lead up to that conference online, and we brought together bishops who were in substantial disagreement over particularly LGBT QI issues, but others too. And it was those sessions online that then enabled the face-to-face encounter to happen in a very different way than it would have done, I think, without that. So in other words, there's something about the space and something about combining online and offline or in person being really powerful.
Thank you. I feel it. I mean, there's something about unlearning our habits in order to be better people in the online spaces. And I think, for the last couple of years, CIP has run summer schools, academic summer schools online, and that has involved working out how we do that well. But I'm confident that if you come across any of the alumni from those, they will tell you what a profound experience it was. And they are very much still in touch with each other. So there are ways of doing that. And again, we had people who might have caring responsibilities or jobs that they needed to keep going, who found that actually that was an opportunity that could work. So I think there's lots to learn about doing that well. Any more? Tim. Right on the edge, so we'll get the microphone across. The microphone is just reaching you.
Tim Winter, yes, grateful to Michael for rather understating his contributions, I think, as usual. And I noted that he didn't mention his amazing work for Coexist House, which is perhaps one of the many pieces in the CIP kind of output jigsaw that hasn't been fully covered. It's amazing. It's another of the ideas that flowed from David's inexhaustible store of good ideas. It goes back at least 20 years. Miriam mentioned briefly that there was something called Abraham House. This was a CIP idea that goes back to the early days of CIP, which would enable us to channel branded Cambridge academic outputs in the curation of a London centre for the understanding of the history and the interaction of the three Abrahamic religions. That since has been reincarnated as something called Coexist House, because the London stakeholders, it's in partnership with the V&A, the City of London, and the Inner Temple. And it's become an independent charity, even though it carries ultimately David's fingerprints all over it at some deep level, because they thought it was inappropriate to exclude the non-Abrahamic religions. But it's certainly still a going concern, and we hope we've located now a place in the City of London, which with appropriate investment injections, any billionaires here, would provide really London's first space. There's more than 300 museums in London, but there isn't one that's dedicated to the city's incredible, diverse, difficult history of religions and their engagements. So we think that as a public education centre with school kids and tourists and others with a huge footfall, this could be one of the sort of long-term sort of blessings of CIP, really. So watch this space.
Thank you, Tim. So I feel like we've touched on a really diverse set of things that CIP has had a hand in. Ideas that are off on a journey, sometimes still sort of a journey that CIP is actively engaged with. Sometimes we've been able to gift those to other people to carry forward, and that in itself is a wonderful thing. So I'm going to indulge just briefly, and this is my penultimate I think it's my last question and my penultimate sort of thing to say. So I've mentioned that we have an interfaith research forum. I've touched on our Religion and Global Challenges initiative, and part of what we're looking to do there is to step a little bit into policy spaces and into the big issues, so climate change. Given that religion is such a profound part of people's lives across the world, what can we be doing in terms of global challenges, and who should we be doing it with? Equally this year, ESRA will take charge for the first time of the religion and conflict pathway. That's an MPhil pathway here in the faculty, which has a slightly higher kind of ratio of people who maybe either come from professional backgrounds and are intending to continue in them, so might be doing it part-time as part of professional development, or may have intentions that take them that way rather than being on a sort of strictly academic career trajectory in terms of their ambitions. And so that's kind of one of the new things going on for us, is to get a bit involved in that. Equally, colleagues have important ambitions to foster a centre for Jewish studies here at the university. and that's something that CIP is also engaged with and supportive of. And then there are fostering conversations like this one, which is one of my ambitions, which is to have these conversations where we learn something about what CIP has been doing, has achieved, and also we try to think together about its new directions and what it can do to go forward. So the question that's coming out of that is, which of those do you think is most exciting, and are the ones that I can make sure to involve you with as we move forward?
Okay, well, it's really exciting to hear all that. It feels like it's a time of renaissance for CIP. It's so great to be back part of that. I think probably the public engagement side of it is what excites me the most, because of all the things we've said on this panel. I tell one very silly anecdote on that. Well, maybe this should have come in the kind of biography how I ended up here, but when I was kind of graduating, Simon Goldhill, which some people here will know him, said to me, "So what graduate work are you going to do, Miriam?" And I said, "I'm not going to do any graduate work because I want to get out there in the real world." And he said, "My dear girl, have you seen the real world?" But there is a world out there, and CIP has so much to bring to it, and I think the world has so much to bring to CIP, so I just want to see that engagement grow and grow.
Yeah, I think the public engagement side is the bit that, pulls on my heartstrings the most, and just figuring out those connections the whole time. I mean, I think, one of the brilliant things about the idea of the project was to take excellent research from the academy and make it available to a different kind of audience. And so any ways in which that can still be done, I think, is really important.
And I definitely haven't covered everything, because hopefully tomorrow you'll hear about shared sacred and sort of visual approaches that are very, very shareable ways of thinking about interreligious relations and interfaith. And gosh, there was another one that kind of passed me, our work on scripture and violence, which will be launching properly probably next January. So that there's plenty going on, and I will be definitely in touch with both of you after this. So the last thing that I want to say, apart from absolutely thanking the panellists for bravely taking this on and dealing with it when I said, that conversation that I mentioned that I thought we might just record over Zoom jointly, I think we're going to live stream it with video the anniversary, and they didn't they went along with me, so that's excellent. So we're not the only organisation celebrating an important, significant anniversary this year. We have with us a representative from the New York-based Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, which marks 30 years this year, honouring the legacy of its inspiration, the late Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum. And for those who are German speakers, I need to point out that this is not Tannenbaum spelled like Christmas tree. This is Tannenbaum with, it's got two ends, but they're separated, right? And I tell you that because you may want to go away and look into it, or you can talk with Janie, who is here with us. And today's panellists have agreed to record reflections as part of Tannenbaum's 3,000 conversation scheme. So I'm trying to organise maybe kind of 20 conversations for a 20th anniversary. They are boldly encouraging people to have and feedback on 3,000 conversations with the goal of building mutual respect. So we will be engaging in that kind of reflective process, and I guess I encourage you all to think about whether you too could add to their log of 3,000 conversations. So the final technical note is that tomorrow our live stream will be via Zoom. So if you're wanting to join us again tomorrow, you will need to make sure that you've picked up the instructions for that. They are available on the CIP website. And that will be 10 a.m. BST tomorrow. I think that we can now applaud everybody again.